Welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. Good to be with you here again. Today on the show, we've got a returning guest, Ben Crenshaw, not a doctor yet, but working on his dissertation up at Hillsdale in Michigan. He is a fifth year. He's in his fifth year there working on his PhD in politics. Ben, thank you so much for coming back on the show today.
Hey, it's really good to be here, Chase. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the topic we're diving into today. Part of the reason I wanted to have you on is because when I start to talk with people in my church or elders or other pastors, and I talk about liberalism, it's an often confusing topic for people as a philosophy. And just so the listener knows, maybe you've listened to a recent episode with Gabriel Wrench up in Moscow, and you heard that. This episode is going to be very academic. Ben is an academic guy. And so we're going to get into philosophy and the history of politics, and particularly liberalism. One of the first books was recommended to me on this topic by another guest I've had on the show, Toby Kurth. And I think it's Patrick, is it Deenan, or how do you say his name, Ben?
Deneen.
Deneen, and it's Why Liberalism Failed. And I think it's a great just intro book. It's fairly easy to read conceptually. It makes sense, and I think we might get into that on the show. But that was my first exposure to like the concept and critique. There you go, you got it right there.
Yeah, we got it right here.
To this topic, but I think it's a major topic. It's one that pertains to my research interest because I wanted to go pre-modern on my PhD in history, and liberalism kind of arose out of the modern era. And so I wanted to get into the history of liberalism with Ben. This is an area he knows a lot about, very familiar to him. So I'm glad to have you on the show to talk about this, Ben. Why don't we start out with just a basic definition for our audience? If somebody were to say, what is liberalism? How would you help them understand a definition of that?
I mean, the kind of the very common definition would be the political philosophy of liberty, and that's because liberalism, its etymological roots is the Latin libertas, which just means freedom. So it's a politics that's oriented around human freedom or liberty. Now, that doesn't really tell you very much. What do we mean by liberty? What are the constraints of it? What are the ends of it? What do you mean by human being? All these kinds of things. These are the questions that you've got to delve into. So it certainly involves a philosophy of human freedom. And by philosophy, I mean political philosophy. I don't mean like a technical study of the discipline of philosophy, which is going to get into like the mind-body problem and the nature of human freedom and free will. And so I mean political philosophy in the sense of how does human freedom relate to the political order, the social and political order. So I find that Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, is very interesting, but I want to bring more sophistication and accuracy to the conversation, because I find that much of what Deneen says is has a ring of truth to it. It has certain elements that are applicable, but there's also a certain level of superficiality there that can be frustrating.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think even with that definition you've laid out, if my audience is, red-blooded American, they're going to go, that sounds great. Freedom. That's what we're all about. You got the Gadsden flag flying in the front yard. Why would I not want liberalism? Liberalism sounds like what it means to be an American. And I think that kind of reveals kind of like some of the confusion on this topic, because for most conservatives, they are kind of in this liberal world. It's kind of like the air we breathe. And so I want to get into the critiques of it. But before we do that, what kind of influenced liberalism? I mean, obviously, I think for a lot of people, they just assume liberalism has always existed. This has always been a net good, net positive. This is what people have always wanted. And now we're at the end of history. And now America is kind of the best that's ever been. And there's been no other order that's ever surpassed, kind of our modern liberal age. So kind of get into the history of liberalism for us.
Yeah, I would say there's a little bit of a debate. Well, I don't know if it's so much of a debate, but just there's a little bit of ambiguity in the scholarship about exactly when liberalism began. If you read, say, Leo Strauss, who was a 20th century political scientist, and his disciples, they emphasize the distinction between the ancients and the moderns. And they say the break between ancient political thought and modern political thought starts with Machiavelli in the 15th and 16th century, Italian Renaissance political thought and so forth. So you could say that Machiavelli is kind of a pre-liberal thinker. He kind of maybe starts the liberal project, and then it finds a greater expression in the thought of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, these guys. So the early moderns are your Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and then you can add in Algernon Sidney, James Harrington, Marmont, Needham, all these other kind of English thinkers and so forth. So what kind of prompted it? Well, I mean, the classic answer is that for someone like Hobbes and Locke, they're trying to find a common denominator for politics that will not lead to bloodshed, war, and violence over differing opinions of the things that are most important in life. Moral customs and norms, habit, moral beliefs, religious beliefs especially. And so you have something like the Reformation in the 16th century, early 16th century, that split Catholic unity in Europe and kind of brought Christendom to an end. And then you have conflicts between Protestants and Catholics throughout the European continent, especially in Germany. This leads to 30 Years' War in the middle of the 17th century. I mean, obviously you have Henry VIII breaking away from the Catholic Church and challenging the Pope on, politically challenging his sovereignty and power. So you have a politics, religion conflict right there. And you have the English Civil War in the middle of the 17th century in England. So you have conflict, lots of conflict that really led to war, conquest, bloodshed, death, persecution of a whole variety of kinds. And so somebody like Hobbes and Locke are saying, look, guys, we got to find a politics that's not going to lead to the annihilation of civilization. We're dealing with, once again, kind of the resurgence of a contest over the most important existential matters of life. Is there a God? What is he like? What is our spiritual, moral duties and responsibilities? Who has religious and political power and authority here on earth to tell us how to live and orient our lives and so forth? So the project is about trying to find kind of a lower common denominator that lowers the stakes in the political and religious life together. Now, to say real quickly, to go back to Machiavelli, he was prior to the Reformation. So his what instigated him was corruption within what he perceived within the Catholic Church, as well as the instability of the Italian republics or city-states in terms of the threat from the Ottomans, the Muslims, and just warring and conflict between the city-states. And so this is why he proposes a republic that basically expands continually, eats up a lot of territory, and you have to grow and become an empire, or as a republic you will die. So you have the impetus there of a commercial empire, a republican commercial empire, basically, with Machiavelli. So those are some of the impetuses, and then within that kind of like it's very much in terms of when you have these fundamental questions that arise again and you have conflict over them, it's a great opportunity for new ideas to spring forth. This is where we are right now, actually, which is why you find this kind of post-liberal, traditional, integralist Catholic thought. You have Christian nationalism, or new nationalist thought, national conservatism. You have a new right. You have a return to kind of a Bronze Age pervert or neo-Nietzschean kind of thing. So if you just go back to Hobbes and Locke, like, they're kind of doing that for their time. They're rethinking the nature of government. Locke is challenging Robert Filmer and his Patriarcha and the concept of absolute paternal monarchy. Hobbes is rethinking the nature of human beings and the origin of politics. they're doing a lot of this kind of thing, and the whole question of equality and liberty that comes up, and they try to give new ideas and new answers to old questions.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I think one of the things that seems baked into kind of the liberal age is one that I've bumped up against in the academy and then in broader efforts, even with Acts 29 and our departure from that. One of the things I kept asking for was kind of this diversity of viewpoints. Like, shouldn't we at least hear from all sides? And so I'd watch these panels, or you'll even see this with like Christianity Today. You'll see they're going to debate, and it's always the way you frame the debate is very interesting, but you'll see a debate on complementarian egalitarianism. And you really, in my mind, I want the best arguments from both sides, and we're gonna have a robust debate, and we're all gonna be friends afterwards, and we can all get along. And it seems to me that in liberalism, one of the efforts to downplay the bloodshed that was experienced and was very comprehensive in Europe at the time was to kind of promote this idea of neutral viewpoint diversity, where we can all just kind of come along and reason together. Is that kind of part of the liberal project? And if so, how does this get things wrong?
So I would not. I would say that it's maybe an implication of the liberal project. And part of the problem here is that, the critique I have of Denis is, he, in his book, Why Liberalism Failed, and subsequent works, I'm in the middle of his new book, Regime Change. He'll talk about, like, say, Francis Bacon. He'll start with Francis Bacon, then he'll add in Hobbes and Locke, kind of a little bit of Rousseau, but not really. And then he'll talk a little bit about the John Stuart Mill and the American founders. And then he says, this is liberalism, just kind of lumps them all together. And he tries to give a couple of like overarching principles of liberalism, and we could get into that in a little bit. There's really, I'm not sure if there's a liberal project. There are liberalisms. Now, what you have today, by the late 20th, early 21st century, you have multiple iterations of liberal decay, liberal renewal. So I would say what we're dealing with today is either like a modern liberalism or a neoliberalism, which really is a form of radicalism, which itself is so far removed from what you find in Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. It's, when you go back and study them, you can say, wow, this is totally different than what people are talking about today. You really won't find a statement of quote unquote neutrality in Hobbes or Locke. In fact, just the opposite. For Hobbes, the government, the Leviathan, can be put into the hands of one person or an assembly, and they have total control over everything. There's no neutrality there. There's no freedom of thought. It's like, no, they will tell you what to think. They even control over opinion. And for Hobbes, different opinion is the source of conflict, which leads to different ways of life, which leads to actual physical violence, which leads to civil war, which leads to death. So you must control opinion. And so this whole idea of like government neutrality, is not really found in Hobbes. So it's really interesting to go back and read these guys, because what you'll find is like Locke is more conservative. If you read the entirety of Locke's corpus, in many ways he's more conservative than the most conservative today. So anyway, I'll just kind of throw that out there as a teaser for anybody who wants to really study Locke. Now, it's not to say that I agree with Locke and everything. I don't agree with him and everything, but he should be read very carefully and taken seriously. So the whole question of neutrality. So on the one hand, what liberalism seeks to do is it seeks to ground a politics by kind of overcoming the friend-enemy distinction, and overcoming it by saying everybody within kind of this liberal politics is going to be a friend. If you agree with basic statement of human equality, that humans should not be politically ruled by a despot or a tyrant, as a master would rule over his slave, which, Locke, this is how Locke reads Filmer, that absolute paternal monarchy is a kind of despotism. And it's based in divine right, or some kind of right by donation that came down from Adam through his heirs, or something like that. Locke's first treatise is a total evisceration of this, critique of this idea. So if you have agreement among all of your friends of basic human equality, you shouldn't be ruled by a despot, and you have basic rights and liberties, and you have the right of property, and you should be able to acquire property and use it within certain boundaries, then we can all be friends, and we can kind of forget about the enemies. And so within kind of this polity, what you do have is an emphasis upon uh, majority rule, which requires a legislature and deliberation, norms, laws that make rules about how politics is going to function, the rule of law. It's kind of a joke these days, the rule of law, but it actually is very important. A single judicial system that's equitably applied to everybody. So in terms of like government's going to function neutrally according to these political and judicial norms, liberalism certainly upholds that, but only for those who are kind of considered friends and accept the basic premises of liberalism to begin with. Now, what ends up happening is that, by the 20th and 21st century, where we are now, liberalism has become so dominant. It has, you mentioned the end of history, the kind of Francis Fukuyama thesis that, with the death of Marxism and socialism and communism in 1989 and 90, with the end of the Soviet Union, modern democratic capitalism and liberalism is the only game in town. Politically, we're at the end of history. There are no other alternatives. Forget Russia, forget China, forget Dugin and his fourth philosophy or whatever he's trying to say over there, assassinate his daughter. Liberalism is it. This is the end of history. This is the only viable politics from here on out. And so the idea that there could be an alternative politics brings up, again, the friend-enemy distinction, which liberalism doesn't want to go there. Modern liberalism doesn't. So that's one answer, is that there's a basic neutrality in terms of rule of law within liberalism. And I think that we've actually benefited from that. And that's okay. What you don't want, which we have a return of, is a dual judicial system, say, and you have privilege for the elites who have their friends and their money and their wealth and their coastal multi-million-dollar homes and their global connections and their Davos forums and whatever. And then you have a separate judicial system that's very harsh on the citizens, a kind of a form of anarcho-tyranny. So that's almost, in a sense, a return to a pre-liberal politics in which there was a favoritism toward the aristocratic class in terms of the judicial system, and maybe like the lower classes, the plebs or the plebeian class didn't even have a judicial system to turn to. So the second answer to the neutrality question is, part of the political philosophy, say, of Locke, is that you have a appeal to a pre-political natural state. It's known as the state of nature. And the idea here is that, Locke in his second treatise says there's actually three societies that exist prior to political society. You have the society of the husband and wife, so you have marriage. You have the society of parents and children, so you have the immediate family. And you have the society of a master and a servant, or the extended household economy. And he said all of that does not yet equal political society. So you have natural association between man and women. This is the natural inclinations that gives rise to children, that gives rise to extended households, villages, and towns. So you have a pre-political society. This is the foundation of private society, private life. Then you have the people come together because maybe they're becoming big enough and complex enough that they need some kind of arbiter, to neutral arbiter or common arbiter who's going to decide disputes among them, a common judge. This gives rise to the political project, the foundation of political society, the people as a political body, the formation of a form of government, of institutions, of norms, like, separation of branches of government, and checks and balances, and representation, and bicameral legislature, all these kinds of things. And so you have this distinction then in liberalism between private and public. So the private life is civil society, this is the family, this is business, this is education, this is mostly how you go about your daily life. And then you have public, which is politics. And politics is necessarily limited to certain things, such as protecting the family, the natural family, protecting natural human equality, natural liberties, natural rights, allowing parents to educate their children as they see fit, staying out of business, and so forth. So, so you do have this idea of a limited public political sphere that cannot engage in or insert itself into the private life, and so it must remain neutral.
Mhm.
So in conflicts among, ecclesiastical matters or education or families or businesses, you have a market, you have a kind of a capitalist marketplace of ideas and a literal economic transactions that take place, and government has to be neutral arbiter between those elements of private society once you have an agreed upon kind of custom and norms and way of going about things. So there does arise this emphasis upon politics and government being neutral because of the appeal to a pre-political natural order of things.
And so with this natural order, because what I'm hearing, and I've seen this, is like it feels like a fantasy. It feels like it's an interesting project, but like if you look at just what's happening in our world, there seems to be kind of two tiers of justice. A recent example would be, I saw a lady who spoke at a school board meeting in California, and she was fired by her company. She was a real estate agent because she was speaking up for parental rights, and all of a sudden these activists found her, doxed her, wrote to her company, got her fired. Her appeal in this video that I was watching last night was basically like, you guys claim to be tolerant and inclusive, but what about me? So she's still appealing to this kind of neutral public square where we can all just kind of coexist together. And it seems untenable to me. Like that's something I used to do too. Like these people are not even, they're hypocrites. They're not even abiding by their own supposed ideals. And yet for someone like me to continue to go back and point out the hypocrisy seems kind of counterproductive. And it's never going to work because they know they're not neutral. And so when somebody comes, whether it is someone on the left who's pretending to be tolerant but is not, or it's someone on the right who comes in with the exclusive claim that Christ is Lord, Jesus is Lord of everything. Um, those seem to be in conflict today, and our neutral public square can't handle that. So, what is the way forward given that condition in liberalism? Can liberalism sustain itself in that kind of conflict?
Yeah. So I mean, again, I'd go back and say that our focus on viewpoint diversity, tolerance, neutrality is kind of become a runaway liberal train. You find, I think, a basic, in some ways, a healthy understanding of this in the early modern period. Basically, if you have a common people and a common way of life with a common religion and a common morality and a common understanding of this is what we're about as a people, then you can have a healthy amount of tolerance for diversity within basic boundaries. But if diversity or tolerance or viewpoint neutrality, whatever you want to call it, itself is elevated to an absolute principle, then what you do is you open the door to all kinds of ideas and ways of life that actually destroy the foundations of your civilization, which is what's happened in America. So the way forward is actually to return to, I would say, either an early liberal or pre-liberal way of thinking about basically the limits of politics. And the limits of politics is a return of kind of this primal or archaic understanding of politics, that it does in some ways start with force or with violence or with at least the right and the willingness to preserve yourself. If you don't even have that, if you don't even have the ability to say, I should be able to preserve myself and my way of life and my understanding of justice and my obligations to God and to my family and to my neighbor, then someone else is going to come along and subjugate you. And
Right.
then, it's the end of you. So you have to be able to draw distinctions between friends and enemies. And, liberalism has at one and the same time banished that thought. You're not allowed to think about that because we're all friends. And at the same time, allowed in enemies that destroy the foundations of say, American society. I'll speak for America because I'm an American. And so it's crippled us. It's eroded the foundations and destroyed the common ways of life, but it forbids us to actually go back to kind of a pre-liberal political way of thinking and acting to reestablish a common people and a common way of life. Um, so of course, we've talked about how there's, you know, everyone today is talking about how there's multiple Americas, and there are multiple people, and having them all come together again as a single people is probably impossible. So to move on to the question of, can liberalism sustain itself? There's two answers to that. The one answer is, when you look at the political thought of Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and I'm kind of dealing with those four. There are others, but those are kind of the classic. You have elements in all of their thought that I think are severely deficient and problematic. That if you tried to build a sustainable political project on them, you would very quickly, if not eventually, run into some deep problems. A lot of that is anthropological. A lot of it has to do with moral philosophy. It does have to do with a thinning or weakening of the political project and the exclusion of religious considerations, spiritual and eternal matters. And so can liberalism sustain itself? Again, it's a problem of like, okay, can Machiavellian political society sustain itself? It's very utilitarian. It's ordered around a princely figure who has a lot of power and force. That can work for a while, but it'll eventually break down. Eventually you will have a prince that's not very wise and doesn't take Machiavelli's advice, or he does take his advice and therefore goes wrong. You can go either way on that. Would a Hobbesian political society break down? Yeah. Locke, it's hard to say with Locke because Locke was a very careful thinker and writer. In his second treatise, he basically just gives these kind of like bare propositions, an outline of the political project, but he doesn't really fill in all the gaps. And so if you go back and you read his essay concerning human understanding, or his thoughts on education, or his reasonableness of Christianity, or his letter on toleration, you try to figure out, well, how did Locke think all this was going to work? And it's hard. It's hard to put it all together because Locke just didn't systematically spell it out the way that Hobbes does in Leviathan or De Cive. So would Lockean foundations eventually break down? I think so, once you understand a lot of Locke's thought. Now, here's the other answer to that. So the first answer is that, can liberalism sustain itself? No. And I think primarily, before I go into the second point, liberalism can't sustain itself because the classic way of talking about this is it lowers the horizons of politics. So in the ancient world, you had an understanding, and you find this in Aristotle's Politics, Book 1, that all political societies begin for the sake of mere life. Self-preservation. You have to say, we're going to make a life together, we're going to exclude these people over here. So the beginning of politics is an act of exclusion. The modern liberal, the modern progressive just melts down in tears over that. How can you possibly exclude people? I mean, you can't even read Aristotle without getting that. So come on, grow up. But then Aristotle goes on very quickly and says, but the purpose of politics is not just mere life, but a life well lived, the good life. What does a good life include? Well, it includes happiness. And what is happiness? It is moral virtue. It is intellectual virtue. It is a kind of citizenship that revolves around a virtuous life. And Aristotle does include elements of the divine, although it's kind of pre-Christian. There's kind of a proto-evangelium there. There's something there that hints toward a divine being, but doesn't go all the way. But what you have with modern liberalism, or not modern liberalism, but the early modern liberals, is you have a lowering of the horizons to just mere life, liberty, property, rights, material goods, economic gain, and so forth. Because why? Well, if you start talking about heaven and hell and the Bible and eternal things and Protestantism versus Catholicism and Reformation and Counter-Reformation, guess what? We're going to have civil war. You can't talk about that. These things lead to conflict. Politics needs to be lowered. We need to find that lower common denominator and so forth. So the lowering of the horizons of politics under liberalism means that it actually cuts out a lot of the necessary moral and religious dimensions that actually makes a viable politics sustainable itself. So it cuts out its own sustainability. This is why you have critiques by Tocqueville and his Democracy in America that democracy in its impulse toward equality kind of leads to this egalitarianism, and it ends up eating itself. It destroys itself. So it has these impulses that destroy itself. Okay, so that's one answer to the can liberalism sustain itself is no. The other answer is to go back to the Greeks and the Romans and their theory or their thought of philosophy of regime change, which is known as anacyclosis. And so this is the idea that you have an aristocracy that devolves into oligarchy and devolves into democracy and then tyranny. That's kind of Plato's take on it in book 8 of the Republic. Aristotle has his own cycle of regimes. Polybius has his own cycles of regimes. And the whole idea here is that the whole question of can we have an eternally sustaining political order is itself impossible. It's just decay. The post-Lapsarian world, I mean, the Greeks wouldn't have talked about this because they didn't have the Christian concept of the fall, but the world is cursed. Humans sin. Things fall apart. And the nature of things is that you're just going to have an evolution. You're going to have a transition from one regime to another. And we see that going on right now. We had a republic, and then it kind of devolved into an aristocracy, which has moved to now an oligarchy or some kind of cabal, some kind of elite cartel, machine politics within kind of the administrative state. And that's either going to turn into complete tyranny, or per Aristotle, maybe we'll swing back toward a democratic republic. Who knows? So you have two answers there. Is it even possible? Is it even worthwhile trying to search for kind of the golden chalice of a perfectly sustainable equilibrium political state that's going to have everything and never fall apart? No, but I think that there are better models than, say, just a bare liberal model.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that comes up is the illustration I've used, and I've used this in my preaching when I'm trying to educate. We did a couple sermon series on politics, albeit not as well read and academic as someone like you might teach on the matter. But the way I kind of described our modern era is like a cut flower. When I buy my wife flowers, and I order them from a company online so that it's very easy. I can just click a button and they're shipped to our house, and they're always the ones she likes, but they're always cut flowers, which means they're not rooted. They're going to die. They will decay, and they sit on the table. And if they're a good bunch, they'll last for maybe a week. If they're a bad bunch, it's a couple days. And so the modern world, the liberal world, seems like a cut flower where it has no roots to sustain itself. By lowering that horizon, it undercuts in favor of having something beautiful for a short time. And so, yeah, I think that's why there's so much interest today about what are alternatives to our current system, because the current system doesn't seem to be working for people. One thing, part of the reason I wanted to have you on was to talk about this concept of liberalism. The other was politics. And the thing that happens with me when I'm talking with other people about these concepts is we're often talking past each other. So I'll offer a critique of liberalism, and they hear me critiquing liberals, and I'm like, no, conservatives are in the liberal framework too. And then the other problem is when I start talking about politics, they think I'm wanting to get partisan or whatever their concept of politics is. But when we go back to the ancients and we talk about politics, we're talking about something that's much more just like the kind of social fabric, the way we arrange ourselves together in a society. But I've heard you say kind of offhand, either on this episode or in other places, that the end of education is politics. And that to a lot of people might sound very provocative today because they're used to an education system that's very neutral. We're just going to teach math and that's what it's going to be. What does it mean when we say the end of education is the political?
I mean, the best way to think about this is to read Aristotle, because he basically says, to have a common people and a common way of life that aren't at each other's throats, that actually can cooperate together, you need a certain kind of person. And this certain kind of person needs to exemplify various virtues. They need courage in war. They need liberality, generosity, magnanimity. They need justice. They need to have a common concept of justice. They need the intellectual virtues. They need prudence and wisdom. They even need a kind of cunning to outwit their enemies or something like that. So you need a people that have these virtues, these moral, social, and intellectual virtues. And how are you going to get virtues out of people? Because all you have to do is live around people, observe yourself and others for a bit to know that people just don't spontaneously become these wonderful, virtuous people. So Aristotle says you need virtuous citizens. You're going to get virtuous citizens through habit and education. And this involves both, there has to be a certain kind of natural aptitude, first of all, like maybe some people just can't seem to get it together. And there's a question there about whether there is such a thing as quote unquote natural slaves, people who are kind of human types, there's a kind of human type that can't ever really rise to the level of human excellence and virtue. I'm going to table that discussion because it's kind of pretty contentious and kind of messy.
Yeah.
But uh, but the issue is that you have to have a certain kind of natural aptitude for virtue, and then you need a combination of habit from youth, from infancy, both in how you were raised in your family and the laws of the polity. How did the laws inculcate you toward a certain way of life, a virtuous way of life, maybe one that was public spirited and said, I should join the military, I should join the Spartan hoplite ranks and fight every season for my city. I should join the American Navy or the Air Force or the Marines. That kind of Midwestern public spiritedness. And then you also need education, not just the laws, not just your family, but you need education. This is how you're going to have a virtuous citizen. And in fact, Aristotle says that citizenship is limited to the virtuous. So you can't have the non-virtuous be citizens because they will destroy your community. So he actually excludes, say, artisans and merchants and farmers. Well, he includes farmers as warriors because they make good warriors. But for other reasons, farmers have to live outside of the city walls in order to do their work. But artisans and merchants, their work themselves, the work they do is kind of debasing. It's actually unvirtuous and debasing. This is his critique of a money economy as opposed to a household economy. It's another kind of technical discussion. So the whole issue here is that education, you can't be virtuous without a certain kind of education, either an education in the laws or a formal education within a school of some sort. And the issue, Aristotle doesn't say it in this many words, but the basic idea is that every education is an education in what it means to be human, an education in what is right and wrong, good and bad, beautiful and ugly, just and unjust. You can't avoid those things. I'm sure if you just have a siloed education in math or something like that, but I mean, even before that, you have to ask and answer those basic questions. So education is necessarily answering these questions about the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, the just, the unjust, which necessarily, leads to the concept of virtue in the human being. So education can't avoid that. And so you're always going to have education wrapped up in the political and vice versa. Now, what liberalism tries to do is it tries to say, okay, yeah, we have a private society where you have education and you have the public society, which is, your politics, and you can separate these. And so politics doesn't have to get involved in education. Now, that kind of worked as long as you had a agreement among the people over what this education was, and there was that for a long time. And in fact, actually, I mean, it's like if you actually study America and you go back, you're going to find all kinds of state laws regarding public education where you have the mix of education and politics right from the beginning, because they just understood you can't, the law has to teach, education is going to teach, it's going to raise up a certain kind of person, a certain kind of citizen. And this person's either going to be able to be a good and decent person in society or not. So you can't avoid the interplay, the mutual influence of politics and education for those reasons.
Yeah, and you even see this. I mean, in the schools in Boulder County, it's common to see, the flags, the Black Lives Matter, the raised fist, the rainbow flag, the trans flag in classrooms in public schools. And on the one hand, it's infuriating because, as someone who was raised in the 90s, under liberalism, you would want public education to be neutral. And I see a lot of parents want this with kind of just teach math and science, stop doing all this. But those people who are typically leftist are hitting at something that's actually true. They're saying that education, in order for it to be comprehensive, should be concerned with matters of justice. Now, of course, how we identify justice matters greatly, and to the degree that Christians remove themselves from those conversations or don't thoroughly engage with a biblical worldview on those matters, they're just giving away. They're giving away everything, and to operate as if I can be a Christian in my private life, but when it comes to public engagement and education, we're not gonna talk about that because I don't want to either offend or we want it to be neutral. This is a fantasy world, and so for Christians, if you're listening, you're a Christian. There's something, there's a tension, and you need to press into that tension, and you need to really explore what it is we're educating people to. This is why I send my kids to a private Christian school, because I want them to be inculcated and educated in a comprehensive framework of what it means to understand the true, the good, and the beautiful, and push towards that end. One of the questions that comes up, and you hinted at it with liberalism, is kind of an egalitarian impulse. And again, we're talking about words that in evangelicalism, when you hear egalitarianism, you're thinking of a particular thing, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about kind of the flattening of hierarchy, the elimination of hierarchy, to where people are just kind of all the same. Um, and ultimately, like in the American system, we have two competing claims. One is you want kind of the freedom to succeed and kind of the equality of opportunity. And then you get, on the other hand, you get the equality of outcome, which is much more socialist. And so is liberalism kind of paired with egalitarianism, Ben, or how does it interact with egalitarianism?
Yeah, so my answer to that is that liberalism is more concerned with equality, and whether or not it actually necessarily devolves into egalitarianism or a kind of modern concept of equity is to be determined. I mean, it has gone that way, but I'm not sure it's necessarily gone that way because of the emphasis upon equality. So let me explain. Um, so egalitarianism is more of a philosophy or a project of kind of making a kind of taking a scythe to all hierarchy, all difference, and making everything a level, equal playing field. This includes, differences between men and women in terms of their physical structure and complementarity in marriage, all kind, different uh, natural abilities and talents in society and so forth. We see that kind of on a extreme level, a rabid level today. Then you have equity. Now, the older concept of equity was just fairness, which is good. That's fine. But now, like you said, it's basically this obsession with equality of outcome. So liberalism, however, like early modern liberalism that you see in Locke, is a argument for natural equality. Now, what Deneen will say is that this natural equality it kind of comes down to this concept of what he calls voluntarism or human choice. And Charles Haywood also talks about this. Charles writes at the Worthy House, and I think Charles is a much more intelligent critic of liberalism than Deneen is. I would read Charles over Patrick any day. So this concept of kind of, autonomous choice, there can be no unchosen bounds. This is what it means to be kind of to be equal, and to be free as well. These equality and freedom kind of go together as pairs. And so Deneen will say basic human equality is, you can't be expected to have obligations or duties toward anything that you yourself didn't choose, including all human relationships, marriage, children, obligations toward your neighbors, other Christians, or something like that. Now, what does Locke say? Locke basically just says in the second treatise that the kind of equality that he's talking about is the right to not be ruled by a political tyrant. He's saying you should have the freedom to order your life, your property, your marriage, your children, your business dealings as you see fit. And he says under the law of nature. So he still has an appeal to natural law, which is a moral law. And Locke clearly thinks that the moral law does not exist without a divine lawgiver, as he makes this clear in other areas. And even says that you know the moral law through reason, and reason is the voice of God within you. This is what he says. So those who have right reason, who are thinking properly, it's basically as if they were plugged right into the divine law or the eternal law, which is very similar to Aquinas. Aquinas says the natural law is the creature's participation in the eternal law. Now, Locke presents it very differently, but you could kind of see how they are similar. So Locke's equality is political equality. It's political equality only. It's equality to say within a political system, whoever is the civil magistrate should not be able to come along, take away your property, take away your wife, enslave you, tell you what to do, impress you into war, ship you up, whatever despotism looks like. And this is how they had experienced kind of paternal monarchy. It was a monarch said, well, I have a divine, right from God. I have a donation from God. I can do whatever I want. So I'll go to war if I want. I'll take the money and the land I want, the wives I want, so forth. So Locke's argument about equality is kind of limited to this political equality. Now, the question is, to what extent does that necessarily imply or have to become extended to other spheres of life? Can you maintain the natural family and the hierarchy within the family, the husband is the head of the wife and the parents over the child? Can you maintain a kind of ecclesiastical hierarchy, within a polity there? Can you maintain social hierarchies and have a kind of a natural aristocracy arise and the best, take on the most important functions in society and so forth? Do those necessarily have to be eliminated and crushed, stemming from Locke's concept of political equality? Now, Locke didn't think so himself. In section 54 of the second treatise, he says, now don't get confused. I'm not saying that men are equal in every way. In fact, men are more unequal than they are equal. And he goes on about, natural abilities and, inheritances and obligations that come from that and all kinds of things. So he clarifies to anybody who cares to actually read Locke that he's not talking about equality in every way. So does this kind of equality necessarily lead to total radical egalitarian society, to an equality in outcomes? I don't think it has to. Now, it did historically, contingently. It did lead to that. And that happened slowly over the course of, 2.5 centuries. And it wasn't even something that was part of the American founding. I mean, Madison in Federalist 10 basically says government's first obligation is to protect the unequal faculties of men from which the rights of property arise. And so if you have unequal faculties, some people are industrious and some people are lazy. And government says, we're not going to pick winners and losers and favor some and over others. And the industrious person acquires a lot of property and puts it to good use and invests and creates all kinds of stuff. They're going to have more than those who have less. And it's not government's job to then come along and take away all the industrious work and productivity of the industrious and give it to the lazy. So, there is an understanding that there's, a basic equality, but there's also going to be inequalities for liberals like Locke and Madison. Now, eventually, throughout the 19th and the 20th century, you have historic changes. You have the rise, you have financial and industrial revolutions. You have the rise of, these economic oligarchs in the late 19th and early 20th century who have massive amounts of wealth, and they're using those to influence politics, to basically kind of like rule through a type of corporatism and crony capitalism. So then you have the impetus upon using politics, using government, the power of government to tamp down and control these economic oligarchs. Now that's a historical evolution and something that these guys 150 years, 200 years before didn't necessarily foresee. So, I want to complicate the story and say we shouldn't be so quick to just be like, well, because Locke talked about equality, therefore, transgenderism.
Yeah, right.
But no, that's so dumb. That's so dumb. So that's probably the best answer quickly I can give to that question.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because yeah, when I hear you talk about Locke on the first kind of glance, it's like, oh well, then that gives rise to all of these things with the erosion of national borders, the rise of transgenderism. I remember singing in high school a song, "Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better," and it was a funny song to play between the boys and the girls, and we would sing that song. And but it was definitely a spirit of the age song, like men and women are the same, they're interchangeable, no one can do anything, there's no hierarchies. And for Americans, we're very very much taught, like, you can be anything you want, there is no hierarchy, no one is better than you, all this kind of stuff. As you get older, hopefully you gain a sense of humility about your own capacities and your own limitations, and you start to realize that's a lie. Like, I can't be anything I want, and I'm very limited in my scope. I have certain physical capacities, intellectual capacities. I'm hindered by sin, all these things. And yeah, I think it's very helpful to understand how the early liberalism, Locke particularly, differs from what we're talking about today with the different issues with egalitarianism, equality of outcome, that kind of thing. One of the things that I've really struggled with personally in my own Christian life, given these kind of the water we swim in, the air we breathe, is how we should conceive of enemies. I know you and I have both talked about Schmidt offline, and for some people that's very controversial. I don't mind reading old dead people and learning from them, but he talks about the friend and enemy distinction. But when I read the Gospels, when I read the Bible, and when I teach it, the Sermon on the Mount seems very pacifistic if you don't take it into the whole corpus of Christianity and the biblical corpus as well. If you just extract the Sermon on the Mount, it seems as if Jesus is advocating pacifism. And then you pair that with kind of a liberal age where we shouldn't have conflict over these things that matter. We shouldn't talk about it. If you go home for Christmas, we're not going to talk about two things, politics and religion. Just so happens to be the things I want to talk about with family, and I think they're important. And so then you enter into this world, you go into a job, or you join some kind of in Boulder would be like a rock climbing group or anything like that, and you find areas of difference. And some people want to avoid those, some people like me want to press into them. But the idea is that if I can just sit down with this person and I can just reason with them, we're all friends here, we're all going after the same thing. And you even see this, Ben, with evangelistic efforts in liberalism. You see kind of this, the way to reach people is to appeal to kind of their natural instincts to pursue good, because we all want to pursue good, we all want the good life. And so you want to appeal to the lowest common denominator. Is this a bad impulse? Is this a helpful impulse? Or how should we conceive of like evangelism, reasoning with people who we disagree with? Can we conceive of them as friends? These are all questions that are really top of mind for me and people that I minister to.
I would say that the impulse toward trying to be friends with people is probably the proper initial impulse, and that labeling or considering somebody as an enemy should be something that you come to after long deliberation and experience. I mean, labeling somebody as an enemy is not a light task. It basically means you have to be willing to kill them, which is a tall ask. So, there's a lot of ways to talk about this. Jesus in Matthew 5. Jesus there, we could exegete this passage quite a bit. I think that the 4 examples Jesus gives of how you ought to treat your enemy and not repay evil for evil, all deal with civil matters. Basically, like a slap is not some kind of assault on your life. It was an insult. Roman impressing you to carry something wouldn't kill you. So Jesus is dealing with civil matters, and he's really dealing contextually with a kind of a Pharisaical and rabbinic Judaism that had taken the eye for an eye, the lex talionis from the Old Testament, to kind of a legalistic extreme in order to get out of, having to do kind things toward those who insult you or are unkind toward you in return. So there's a whole kind of slew of biblical and theological matters there, historical context and such, we could get into. I don't think that. I mean, my gosh, like, look, the entire atonement of Christ is this massive friend-enemy conflict. It's
Yeah.
this massive like power struggle between God and the devil, and God conquering and destroying death and sin and evil and Satan, and saying and inviting all of us to be his friends and to be enemies with those who hate God and who side with Satan. So I was just yesterday, I was doing evening prayer with my wife and little boy, and I was reading Psalm 139. This is David, this great psalm. It's the one that says, "You have formed me in my inward parts," and so forth. At the very end, though, he says, "Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies." Then he turns right around and says, "Now God, search me and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me." Meaning, I can hate what you hate with utmost hate and call them my enemies, and still not there be anything grievous within me. So I think an actual biblical theology on friends and enemies would show that we are able to hate what is evil, and that even means people who have kind of given themselves so far over to evil that we can hate them because they are God's enemies. And I don't think that necessarily means we'll just like, well, let's just kill them all.
Right.
That would have that, the kind of self-preservation or the preservation of a people and a way of life would be the last resort. Now, the problem in America currently is that when we have supposedly external enemies, although liberalism as a global enterprise, kind of the liberal international order, which is something that arose after World War II, and that's another conversation, tries to overcome the kind of the older understanding of foreign policy under the law of nations, which says that nations are in a state of nature with each other, and there is no common arbiter. There's nothing they can appeal to except for the divine law or the natural law, the goodwill of others. The modern international liberalism tries to overcome that and make everybody in the whole world friends.
Right.
But it does that by exterminating, like, say, Putin in Russia and others who they are allowed to call enemies and destroy through
Right.
proxy wars.
Yeah.
So we do have, I think true Americans would understand, we do have external enemies. And we also have internal enemies. We have enemies that are sitting in Washington, D.C. and running the government. Now, our approach to that, very strategic, very prudential, very careful in what we say, and so forth. And I don't necessarily think that even to our own government, we have to take a blowtorch. There's
Right.
other avenues. There's a lot of different strategies here. The parallel economy, there's reform from within, there's retaking institutions that have long predated those who have usurped them and now turned them toward abusive ends. Now, to quickly go back, liberalism, like I said, with Hobbes and Locke, you definitely find this impulse to try to overcome the friend-enemy distinction in order to tamp down on bloodshed and violence. On the other hand, 100 years later, you have the American founding, which starts with distinction between friends and enemies, the
Right.
labeling of certain people among themselves as royalists and loyalists and Tories, and kicking them out, literally physically kicking them out and saying, you must go to Canada, you must flee back to England because we can't have a common way of life with you. You're trying to submit us to political despotism by turning us into slaves, by taxing us to death and taking our property and impressing us and having your soldiers quartered in our house and destroying our livelihoods. And so America started with a friend-enemy distinction and the willingness to wage a war to defeat one's enemies. So I think that that's in America's DNA. And look, these guys were all Christians. They didn't have a problem with it. And when you go back and you study their theology and their political theology, they had a much healthier understanding of this. We were very weak, very effeminate. We've read too many books by Russell Moore, listen to Christianity Today,
Right.
and these kind of these weak and debased evangelical voices that have really kind of I think have twisted the theology of Scripture. I think the American generation, the late 1700s, didn't understood this much better. And that's how they were able to found the country. And then after that, like, yeah, there was certainly an understanding that we're all friends and we need ways to get along, but also the inventions of prudence in terms of an improved political science that Hamilton talks about in Federalist Number 9 is that we have to have checks and balances. We need to disperse power, because if we have too much power in one hands, we're going to have a homegrown enemy.
Yeah.
And of course, there has been conflict in America through different groups throughout our history. Now, one of the most important things to understand is the original origin of political parties in America was this concept of legitimate or viable opposition. So you have, say, like the Whigs and the Jacksonians in early 19th century America. And like they saw themselves as very different, but they still had some common ends together. So they saw each other as legitimate opposition, which is why you could have a peaceful transfer of power for so long. Even then, you had the Democrats and you had Republicans. But what's happened in the 20th century, late 20th century, especially after the kind of progressive political regime revolution, and FDR and the New Deal and the post-war liberalism and globalism, the rise of the administrative state, what you have is the rejection of the other party as a legitimate opposition.
Right.
They're now labeled enemies, which is why Trump is being indicted over and over and over. Anybody who goes along with the Trump GOP is an internal enemy.
Right.
They are no longer legitimate opposition. They must be conquered, destroyed, absolutely crushed. And so this is we're well underway with a one-party rule in America. So this is not politics like usual in America. This is actually something new, and it means that we ourselves have to start thinking in terms of an early liberal or pre-liberal political conceptuality. If we want to understand what's going on, what's happened in D.C., what's happened in the election of 2020 and Trump, even why Trump arose in the first place, what happened with Nixon, and so forth. We have to reach back into our collective American and Western past and have a better conceptuality of politics in order to deal with this.
Yeah, and I think that helps because one of the issues that comes up is like a lot of people, a lot of Christians, well-meaning Christians that I know, they may not feel comfortable with labeling people enemies, but there's people out there that are very comfortable labeling them enemies. And so, it's kind of like that old adage, you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And so you got to get this stuff kind of sorted out. Like at our church, when we had a local elected official saying our church and our beliefs are not welcome in this town, what are you going to do with that? Because we're not special. We're not unique in that way. I mean, that's a common understanding of a Bible believing church in a secular context is your beliefs are bigoted. They're outdated. It's an enemy of democracy. When you claim Christ as Lord, you are a threat, and you've even seen this propaganda put out by MSNBC, NBC, all the major networks. And so how do we as Christians, you may wish to be friends with everybody. And you know what? Like there's some biblical truth to that. As much as it is when you live at peace with other men, amen. However, when somebody labels you an enemy, declares you an enemy, and seeks to end your way of life, what are you going to do about that? What are you going to do about that? And so that's a question that's been rattling around in my mind for the last 3 years. And I think a lot of this conversation at least helps us get people introduced to a lot of the resources in the past. And that's my hope for you as an audience, if you're listening, is look, there's a lot of opportunities to go learn about a different way of life. Maybe not a different way of life, but a different way of thinking about the political. That's not necessarily partisan, although it will be perceived as partisan, that you can go to and you can explore, because it's going to give you key insights. If you're still living what I would call asleep in our modern age under liberalism in its hypocritical ways, while they claim to have this kind of neutral worldview, this kind of neutral public square, but if you turn on the news, if you watch a show, anything like that, it's not neutral. We don't live in that world. And so what are you going to do about it? So I think this was really helpful. Obviously, Ben, you're well studied in this, so I appreciate you taking some time to educate people on the concept of liberalism. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, I think thanks, Chase. My last quick thought is that kind of what you were saying there is that modern liberals are not liberals. Actually, they're pre-liberals, and they've abandoned the liberal project even while calling themselves liberals. And if you want, as Christians, what we need to do is think in terms of what are the ends for which others are living. Do they call evil good? Do they deny the existence of God? Do they seek to destroy God's creation and, as God has intended humans to live? So I think those are some of my final thoughts. And so hopefully this conversation's been helpful. And we could dive into a lot more technical detail. I'd love to talk more about Hobbes's anthropology, Locke's moral philosophy, his Epicureanism. These are some of the problems in liberalism, and why I think we have rumblings about this all began in the 17th century or something like that. So there's a lot more here. I would really suggest that listeners, if they're curious, just go read these authors for yourself. Don't necessarily listen to Deneen. Don't not read Deneen. I mean, read Deneen, understand him, but explore it for yourself. So thanks a lot for having me on. It's been really great.
Yeah, for sure. And if people want to keep up with you and what you're doing, is there a place where they can find your thinking, writing, teaching, anything like that?
You can follow me on Twitter. I think my handle is at Ben R. Crenshaw, all one word. I'm not super active on Twitter. I do write for American Reformer quite a bit. I'll be writing for the American Mind a little bit. Otherwise, Twitter's probably the best place. I have a Facebook profile, but I don't do anything on Facebook nowadays. Sure. That's it.
That's great. Well, if you're a listener and you enjoyed this show, I'll put a link in the show notes to his Twitter profile. You can reach out to him, Ben, on that. And I want to have Ben back on because anthropology is a big interest of mine. So maybe we can get another episode on Hobbes and anthropology and other stuff like that. So that'd be great. But if you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, I'd love to give it a great rating, subscribe on YouTube, send this episode to a friend, start a conversation on the topics you're not supposed to talk about with people, politics and religion. And hopefully this equips you as a Christian to think more comprehensively and thoughtfully about how we interact in our modern world. I really, part of the reason I started the podcast was to equip you, to help you, but also to just help me be a better thinker. So thanks so much for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time.